The winds cut through the Judean hills with a gloomy whistle. The people walked sullenly through the streets of Jerusalem, like shadows of their former selves. The glow of the holy city had gone out, not for lack of lamps, but because something much worse was happening. The temple, the holiest place for the Jews, had been desecrated. The pillars that once supported faith now supported pagan idols. The altar, which once saw sacrifices to God, was now stained with the blood of filthy pigs offered to foreign gods. All this came from a single man, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He called himself God Manifest, but to the Jews he was just a tyrant trying to erase their identity. His aim was to turn the chosen people into mere Hellenized subjects, making them forget their laws, their God, and even their own language. Anyone who refused would pay with their life. The reports were terrifying. Mothers having their children torn from their arms for insisting on circumcision, wise old men tortured for not eating unclean meat, entire families burned alive for keeping the Sabbath holy. Fear spread like a plague, and resistance seemed impossible. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting Bible stories and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. If you like the content, feel free to support our work with a financial aid by clicking on the Thanks a Lot button. You can also become a member of the channel and enjoy exclusive benefits. But not everyone was willing to bow down. In a small village called Modim, a man of advanced age, but with fire in his eyes, stood up against tyranny. His name was Mattathias, a priest from the lineage of the Hasmoneans. When a Seleucid official ordered him to sacrifice an unclean animal in the name of the king, Mattathias did something unexpected. In an outburst of holy fury, he took up his sword and killed the Jewish traitor who had come forward to carry out the order. The silence was followed by screams and chaos. Blood splattered on the ground as Mattathias and his sons raised their weapons. There was no turning back. They fled to the mountains, and with them was born something that would change Israel's destiny. Among those sons was a young man called Judas. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to become God's answer against oppression. Judas gripped the hilt of his father's sword, feeling the weight of steel and responsibility on his shoulders. The wind from the mountains blew strongly, bringing with it the smell of damp earth and dry leaves, but also the whisper of war. Since the night they fled Modim, he and his brothers had never returned home. They lived as fugitives, refugees among rocks and caves, always on the lookout for the footsteps of the Seleucid soldiers who hunted the rebels like animals. But something was changing. Fear was beginning to give way to hope, and Judas knew that they could no longer just hide. Matthias led the resistance as long as he could, but the weight of age and battles was relentless. His last breath was not one of despair, but of defiance of fate. With a weak voice, he gathered his sons around him and said, "Be strong in the law and ready to fight for our people." And then he left. The loss of their father was a blow, but it didn't break them. On the contrary, it hardened Judas's heart like iron being forged in fire. His brothers' eyes turned to him, and it was at that moment that the leader they needed was born. Judas was not just a warrior, he was a born strategist. He didn't have the luxury of a trained army or shiny armor, but he knew that there was something much more powerful than brute force, the courage and faith of a people who would not surrender. He studied the mountain paths, knew every hidden trail and every gorge that could become a trap for the enemy. They began with small attacks, quick ambushes, hitting the Seleucid soldiers and disappearing before they could react. Each victory, however small, made their fame grow. And soon, the king's armies would realize that this group of rebels was not a passing nuisance. Judas's name began to spread through the villages and even among the Greek soldiers themselves. But it wasn't just his name that caused a chill. It was the nickname he would carry for the rest of his life. The hammer of Israel had been forged and would soon be put to the test. News of the Maccabees' revolt reached Apollonius, one of the most ruthless generals in the Seleucid army. He didn't see Judas as a real threat. For him, a band of peasants armed with improvised spears and stones could not resist a well-trained troop. Convinced that he would crush the rebellion with ease, he set off with a large contingent of soldiers, marching with shiny shields and spears raised as if they were already celebrating victory. Judas, on the other hand, knew he wouldn't win a direct battle. His men were few and without heavy armor, but they had something the Seleucids didn't: the advantage of the terrain and the certainty that they were fighting for something greater than themselves. He studied every bend of the Beit Horon Pass, where he intended to surprise the enemy. The road was narrow, surrounded by hills on either side. If the Greeks went in too confidently, they would be trapped. And that's exactly what happened. Apollonius marched fearlessly, leading the troops like a wolf that sees its prey cornered. But as the column of soldiers advanced along the narrow path, Judas and his men emerged from the shadows, like bolts of lightning cutting through the sky. Stones rolled down from above, thrown with deadly accuracy. Shouts of surprise mingled with the clang of metal falling to the ground. Before the Greeks could reorganize, the Jews descended like a storm. Swords met flesh, spears were torn from enemy hands, and the gorge became a tomb for the Seleucids. Apollonius had no time to react. Judas found him in the middle of the chaos, and with a single blow, knocked the general from his saddle. The enemy's body fell lifeless, and his sword glittered in the sunlight. Judas picked it up and raised it above his head like a war trophy. It was not just a symbol of victory, but a warning. The hammer of Israel had struck for the first time. The wind was cutting through the mountains when the first scouts arrived with the news. Seron, commander of the Seleucids, was marching with an army even larger than Apollonius. His aim was clear: to avenge his companion's defeat and crush the revolt before it became a bigger problem. Unlike his predecessor, Seron didn't underestimate Judas. He knew that the rebel leader was not a simple peasant with a sword in his hand, but a strategist who used the soil itself as an ally. Even so, Seron believed that a well-armed army was enough to quell any resistance. Judas, on the other hand, was not intimidated. His men were few, tired and poorly equipped, but his recent victories had lit a fire in their hearts. They weren't just fighting to survive, they were fighting for something sacred. The Seleucids advanced confidently down the narrow valleys that snaked through the Judean mountains. The soldiers marched in close formation, protected by shields and spears that glittered in the sun. Seron rode ahead, watching the road with the certainty of a man who already saw himself victorious. Judas was waiting for them in one of the most treacherous passages in the region. He knew every stone in the ground and knew that Seron was falling into the same trap as Apollonius. When the Seleucids entered the valley gorge, the ambush began. The silence of the morning was broken by the sound of shouts and the roar of the first assaults. The Jews attacked with speed, cutting through the enemy lines before they could react. Seron tried to reorganize the troops, but the terrain was against him. Soldiers stumbled, falling over each other. Chaos ensued. Judas advanced like lightning through the tumult, making his way to Seron. The commander barely had time to raise his sword before he felt the blow that knocked him off his mount. As his body hit the ground, the Seleucids panicked. The army that had once marched confidently was now fleeing in despair. King Antiochus could no longer ignore the problem. Apollonius and Seron had been humiliatingly defeated, and now the Jews were not just a group of rebels hiding in the mountains, but an army growing in strength and numbers. If the revolt wasn't crushed soon, it could spread like wildfire across a dry field. It was then that Gorgias, one of the most respected Seleucid generals, was called in to settle the matter once and for all. Gorgias was not like previous commanders. He didn't underestimate Judas or rely solely on the strength of his army. He had experience and cunning and planned a precise attack. He gathered more than 5,000 elite soldiers, as well as cavalry and experienced mercenaries. His strategy was simple: attack Judas at night when his men were tired and unprepared. If he managed to take them by surprise, he would crush them before they had a chance to react. But Judas had already foreseen this. He knew the mindset of the Seleucid generals and knew that sooner or later they would try a sneak attack. So instead of waiting for the enemy in his camp, he did the unexpected. He left the place empty and marched his army in silence through the darkness. When Gorgias attacked, he found an abandoned camp with no sign of the rebels. Confused, he believed that they had fled in fear and began to search for them in the surrounding area. Meanwhile, Judas and his men were advancing in the opposite direction, directly towards the main camp of the Seleucids, which was almost defenseless. In a swift and ferocious attack, they set fire to the tents, destroyed the supplies, and massacred the soldiers who had stayed behind. When Gorgias realized what had happened, it was too late. The general, humiliated, was forced to retreat. News of the defeat spread like thunder throughout the Seleucid Empire. Judas was not only a warrior, but a strategist who made his enemies look like fools. And his greatest victory was yet to come, a victory that would restore something long lost. Judas's soldiers were running through the streets of Jerusalem, but this time it wasn't to escape. For the first time in years, there were no Seleucid oppressors to chase them, no decrees forbidding their prayers. The city gates were open, and the dust of battle still hung in the air. They had won. The temple, previously taken over by pagan rites, stood before them, immense and silent. But when Judas crossed the courtyards and looked inside, he felt something heavy in his chest. This was no longer the house of God. The columns were stained with the blood of unclean sacrifices. The sacred altar had been desecrated. Idols of stone and gold lurked in the shadows like intruders. The smell of foreign incense still permeated the air. It was as if Israel's own faith had been wounded. For a moment, the silence was absolute. No warrior dared to take a step forward. Then Judas took a deep breath, raised his sword, and shattered the first pagan statue with a dry blow. The crash of the cracking stone echoed like thunder, and it was the signal for everyone to start restoring what had been lost. They purified the temple with tears in their eyes, tearing out every trace of the desecration. Once again, they erected a worthy altar, and finally the time came to relight the menorah, the sacred lampstand that was supposed to shine continuously. But when they looked for pure oil, they found only a small flask, enough for a single day. Even so, they lit the flame. And then the unexpected happened. The oil didn't burn out quickly. It remained burning, day after day, for 8 whole nights, enough time to prepare more pure oil. The people of Israel knew then that God was with them, and that day was marked forever. But even this victory didn't mean the end of the struggle. The smoke of the pure incense still rose in the restored temple, and the light of the menorah flickered as if dancing in triumph. But the celebration didn't last long. Somewhere far away, beyond the mountains and deserts, the news of Judas Maccabeus' victory had reached the ears of a man who knew no mercy. Lysias, Antiochus IV's right-hand man, would not allow this humiliation to go unpunished. If Jerusalem thought it was in the clear, it would soon discover that the storm had only just begun. This time, the Seleucids would not make the mistakes of the past. Lysias assembled a gigantic army, 30,000 experienced soldiers, heavy cavalry, and even war elephants, colossal beasts that crushed everything under their feet. When the troops marched out, the ground shook as if the earth itself feared the coming destruction. Judas and his men were brave, but they were outnumbered, and they knew they wouldn't be able to withstand a direct attack. So what did they do? Something unthinkable. Instead of waiting for destruction to come knocking on Jerusalem's door, they decided to strike first. They marched out to meet the enemy with a courage that bordered on madness. On the battlefield, The forces clashed like furious tides. The sound of swords echoed through the valley, and the elephants advanced like living mountains, making their way through the dust and blood. But Judas was no ordinary man, and his war was not just one of flesh and steel. He and his warriors fought as if God himself were on their side, toppling giants and scattering an army that, on paper, should have crushed the resistance. Lysias, humiliated and with an army in tatters, retreated. For the first time, the empire began to realize that the revolt of the Maccabees was not just a passing insurrection, but not everyone was happy with this victory. And the worst threat doesn't always come from outside. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy wears the same clothes, speaks the same language, and prays to the same God. Judas Maccabeus had defeated Lysias, restored the temple, and proved that the Seleucids were not invincible. But within the Jewish people themselves, there were those who didn't see their struggle as liberation, but as an affront. One of them was Ishmael, an ambitious priest who, unlike Judas, didn't care about faith or the law. He wanted power, and for that he was willing to ally himself with his own oppressor. The Seleucids quickly realized that brute force wasn't working, so they changed tactics. Defeated on the battlefield, they decided to corrupt the hearts of the people. Alcimus was chosen to be the new high priest, but not for his devotion, but for his loyalty to King Demetrius. He arrived in Jerusalem with false promises of peace, saying that everything could return to normal if Judas gave up the revolt and accepted foreign rule. But Judas knew the smell of betrayal. He knew that giving in would mean condemning everything they had fought for. Alcimo, frustrated at not convincing the rebel leader, asked the new Seleucid commander, Maccabees, a ruthless warrior, for help. And so the war returned, but now with a bitter taste. Many Jews, deceived by Alcimo, turned against Judas. Friends began to become enemies, and the army that had previously fought together began to fragment. Meanwhile, Maccabees, with an even larger army, marched to crush the hammer of Israel once and for all. This time, the fight would not only be against spears and swords, but against doubt, weariness, and fate itself. And in the midst of this chaos, Judas would face his last and most brutal battle. The sky was grey when Judas Maccabeus clenched his fists and looked around. The army that had once marched at his side with fervor was now a shadow of its former self. Many had deserted, convinced by Alcimo's treacherous promises or frightened by Maccabees' overwhelming force. The enemy was stronger than ever, and Judas knew that the coming battle would not be like the previous ones. There were no ambushes this time. There was no hiding in the mountains. The fight would take place in the open, and the numbers were against him. The scouts returned with the worst possible news. Maccabees was marching with an army so large that the dust raised by his soldiers obscured the horizon. There were cavalry, archers, spearmen, and the discipline of a ruthless war machine. But Judas would not back down. He never backed down. His fight wasn't for glory. It wasn't for power. It was for something much bigger. If the Seleucids wanted to erase him from history, he would ensure that his name was remembered until his last breath. The clash between the armies was brutal. The clangor of metal was mixed with the cries of the wounded and the thunder of hooves. Judas fought on the front line, as he always did. His blow was sure. His presence set fire to those who still had the courage to stand by his side. But the battle was becoming increasingly desperate. His men fell one by one, and the enemy seemed to have no end. Then came the inevitable moment. Surrounded with no room to retreat, Judas found himself alone against dozens of Seleucid soldiers. But he didn't go down like a defeated man. With his sword still firmly in his hand, he advanced to strike his last blow. The hammer of Israel was felled, but not broken. The body of Judas Maccabeus lay on the field of Elasa, surrounded by blood-stained swords and Seleucid soldiers who now looked at him with a mixture of respect and fear. The hammer of Israel had been silenced, but his fight didn't end there. If the Seleucids thought that his death would bring an end to the resistance, they were mistaken. The news of Judas's fall spread like wildfire, reaching every village, every home, every man and woman who had believed that freedom was possible. But instead of burying hope, his death ignited an even greater flame. His brothers, Jonathan and Simon, took the lead in the revolt and continued the war. The resistance, now more determined than ever, reorganized, grew and counterattacked with renewed force. The war against the Seleucids lasted for years. There were defeats, betrayals, and moments of despair. But the seed that Judas planted could not be uprooted. His courage inspired not just warriors, but an entire people to never again accept foreign rule. And so, against all odds, Judea won its independence. For the first time in centuries, an autonomous Jewish government was established, and the descendants of the Maccabees would rule the land for generations. The name of Judas Maccabeus has not been forgotten. He became a symbol of resistance, faith, and bravery. He wasn't a king, he didn't have a golden throne or riches. But he had something much greater, the heart of a man who believed that faith cannot be erased, that freedom is worth any sacrifice, and that even when the battle seems lost, there are always those who will raise their sword to continue the fight. The years passed, the battles became memories, and the kings who came after Judas Maccabeus fell into oblivion. But his name has never faded. He didn't rule an empire, build palaces, or leave riches. He left something much greater, a legacy, an example of courage that has spanned the centuries, a name that echoes whenever someone refuses to bow down in the face of injustice. Judas was not just a warrior, he was a man of unshakable faith. He didn't fight for ambition or revenge. His sword was guided by the certainty that some things are too sacred to be negotiated. He faced armies that seemed impossible to defeat, not because he believed he was stronger, but because he knew that true strength does not lie in the size of the army, but in the conviction of those who hold the weapons. How many times in life do we come up against battles that seem too big? How many times does fear whisper that it's better to give up? Judas teaches us that greatness lies not in the absence of fear, but in the decision to fight even when all seems lost. His hammer didn't just destroy enemies, it forged hope in a people who no longer believed in their own strength. And so his story continues. With each generation, there are those who carry his flame, who stand up against oppression, who choose faith over accommodation. With every challenge we face, we can hear the echo of his footsteps, the sound of his sword cutting through the air, the reminder that a man can make a difference when he refuses to accept the impossible. Because, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how many armies rise up or how powerful the enemy is. As long as there are those who refuse to kneel, the spirit of Judas Maccabeus will live on. If you like the story of Judas Maccabeus and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.